Hi there, faithful listeners. Welcome to the Bible Explained on this lovely Monday morning. Thank you so much for sharing a delicious cup of coffee with me as we discuss 2 Chronicles chapter 8. So you might hear some clicking of toenails. That's my dog, Cody, walking around the room. He's not happy to be trapped in here with me. I have my door shut because my husband's working on something in the other room. And generally, my husband's not home when I'm recording episodes, but today he is. And so to not bother him and for him to not bother me, we've got the doors shut. And so Cody is stuck in here with me. And so he's just pacing the floor. But he should settle down in just a few minutes here. But let's go ahead and read 2 Chronicles 8, the entire thing. We're going to be discussing the reign of Solomon and all of the various things that he did with Israel and how impressive he really made Israel to be. So I'll be reading this as I usually do from the WEB, but grab your favorite version of the Bible and also your cup of coffee this morning as we discuss this passage together. At the end of 20 years, in which Solomon had built Yahweh's house and his own house, Solomon built the cities which Hiram had given to Solomon, and caused the children of Israel to dwell there. Solomon went to Hamath Zobah, and prevailed against it. He built Tadmor in the wilderness, and all the storage cities, which he built in Hamath. He also built Beth Horon, the upper, and Beth Horon the lower, fortified cities with walls, gates, and bars, and Baalath, and all the storage cities that Solomon had, and all the cities for his chariots, the cities for his horsemen, and all that Solomon desired to build for his pleasure in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and in all the land of his dominion. As for the people who were left of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, who are not of Israel, of their children who are left after them in the land, whom the children of Israel didn't consume, of them Solomon conscripted forced labor to this day. But of the children of Israel, Solomon made no servants for his work, but they were men of war, chief of his captains, and rulers of his chariots and of his horsemen. These were the chief officers of King Solomon, even 250 who ruled over the people. Solomon brought up Pharaoh's daughter out of David's city to the house which he had built for her. For he said, "My wife shall not dwell in the house of David king of Israel, because the places where Yahweh's ark has come are holy." Then Solomon offered burnt offerings to Yahweh on Yahweh's altar which he had built before the porch, even as the duty of every day required, offering according to the commandment of Moses on the Sabbath, on the new moons, and on the set feasts, 3 times per year, during the feast of unleavened bread, during the feast of weeks, and during the feast of booths. He appointed, according to the ordinance of David his father, the division of the priests to their service, and to the Levites to their offices, to praise and minister before the priests as the duty of every day required, the doorkeepers also by their divisions at every gate, for David the man of God had so commanded. They didn't depart from the commandment of the king to the priests and Levites concerning any matter or concerning the treasures. Now all the work of Solomon was accomplished from the day of the foundation of Yahweh's house until it was finished. So Yahweh's house was completed. Then Solomon went to Ezion-Geber and to Eloth, on the seashore in the land of Edom. Hiram sent him ships and servants who had knowledge of the sea by the hands of his servants, and they came with the servants of Solomon to Ophir, and brought from there 450 talents of gold, and brought them to King Solomon. This chapter obviously delves into Solomon's reign, and just how impressive of a king Solomon really was for Israel. Actually, under King Solomon, Israel was extremely wealthy. It says in 1 Kings that Solomon made silver as plentiful as stones in the street. Like, that was how rich Israel had become. Because Solomon was a very wise man, as we know. God granted Solomon with essentially supernatural wisdom, where Solomon became like the wisest man on the planet. And other kings would come and seek Solomon's advice and counsel. So Solomon was an impressive king, and he built Israel so beautifully in his lifetime. So it says, at the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built Yahweh's house and his own house, Solomon built the cities which Hiram had given to Solomon and caused the children of Israel to dwell there. So this is actually kind of a funny story. This is talked about in 1 Kings chapter 9, where you know that King Hiram, or Hiram as scripture sometimes names him, He was the king of Tyre, and Solomon had a very good reputation with him. And so they liked each other. They were on very good terms. So at one point in time, Solomon actually gave some cities to Hiram. So here's what 1 Kings 9:10 through 14 says. At the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built 2 houses, Yahweh's house and the king's house, now Hiram, the king of Tyre, had furnished Solomon with cedar trees and cypress trees and with gold, according to all his desire. King Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. Hiram came out of Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, and they didn't please him. He said, "What cities are these which you have given me, my brother?" And he called them the land of Kabul to this day. And the word Kabul in Hebrew basically sounds like good for nothing. He essentially called these cities crap and told Solomon, like, I don't like these cities. Like, why are you giving me these cities? I don't want them. So in 2 Chronicles 8, our passage for today, it seems like Hiram gave those cities back to Solomon. And so Solomon built them up in verse 2. Solomon built the cities which Hiram had given Solomon and caused the children of Israel to dwell there. So, yeah, needless to say, Hiram did not like those cities and gave them back to Solomon and wondered why Solomon gave him those cities. Solomon went to Hamath Zobah and prevailed against it in verse 3. He built Tadmor in the wilderness and all the storage cities which he built in Hamath. And so now in verses 3 through 6, it talks about Solomon's various conquests, which were very few actually, because Solomon was a king of peace, interestingly enough. He didn't have a lot of wars on his hand. He was so strong that people just kind of didn't mess with him. So the only area that we know of that Solomon went out to war against was Hamath Zobah. And of course, Solomon was successful in that battle and took that city. And he also built up the cities of Tadmor and Hamath, Beth Horon, and Baalath. And all of these cities were considered to be storage cities. So just like somebody like places all their storage like in their attic or in their garage or basement or something, Solomon had so much stuff that he had actual cities for it, and they were considered to be storage cities. Some of these cities would hold chariots, others would hold all the horses and whatever else Solomon had acquired over the years, because we know that Solomon was very entrepreneurial, as we find out at the very end of this chapter. He did things that Israel wouldn't have even thought possible, probably like 40 years prior to him. So he was entrepreneurial and he acquired a lot of things, probably that silver and that gold, like I talked about earlier, not to mention all these chariots and weapons and horses that he would leave in these cities. And he actually says he had a city for his horsemen as well. He built everything he desired for his pleasure in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and in all the land of his dominion. So not only was Solomon building up storage cities and building fortified towns and just making sure Israel was very strong, but he also built a lot of entertainment so that the people would have fun things to do in every single city. And you can see Solomon was very concerned about beauty, about order, and about having fun, because that's talked a lot about in the Proverbs and also in the book of Ecclesiastes as well, which those 2 books Solomon obviously wrote. So in that way, Solomon was a very good king for Israel. But he wasn't such a good king for the people who were not Israelites, as we find out in verse 7. As for all the people who were left of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of Israel, of their children who were left after them in the land, whom the children of Israel didn't consume, of them Solomon conscripted for forced labor to this day. So these guys were slaves. Anybody that was a foreigner still living in Israel, Solomon put to work. He made them slaves. It does say right here that the children of Israel, so the Israelites themselves, Solomon made no servants for his work, but they were men of war, chief of his captains, and rulers of his chariots and of his horsemen. So the Israelite people themselves, he did not make into slaves. And forgive me, that is something I taught incorrectly a few episodes back. When Solomon was building the temple, I talked about the forced labor, and I mentioned that some of the Israelites might have been conscripted to forced labor as well. But that is not true based upon what we read right here in 2 Chronicles 8. The Israelites themselves were not slaves. However, we do find out that Solomon put a very big burden on the backs of the Israelites also. Even though they weren't slaves, they were still servants of the king. They had to do what the king told them to do. And you can see in this chapter that Solomon was a worker. He was doing all sorts of different things throughout his entire reign, from building up cities, going out to war, making all sorts of alliances with other nations, and even having people go out to sea and learn how to become sailors. He probably expected all of these people to work very, very hard. Solomon was a workaholic and probably expected that of his people as well. He put big burdens on their back, and we find that out in 1 Kings chapter 12, right after Solomon dies. And Rehoboam, Solomon's son, becomes the next king. The Israelites were very unhappy with Solomon at this time. So here's what this says, 1 Kings 12, 1 through 5. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. When Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was in Egypt, where he had fled from the presence of King Solomon, and Jeroboam lived in Egypt, and they sent and called him, Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Your father made our yoke difficult. Now therefore, make the hard service of your father and this heavy yoke which he put on us lighter, and we will serve you. He said to them, Depart for 3 days, then come back to me. So the people departed. Israel was very divided at this point as well. They were extremely angry at Solomon, and there was talk of splitting and civil war at this point. So when all of these people go to Rehoboam and they're like, please lighten our loads, that's kind of the deciding factor if Israel is going to split or remain one nation. And it turns out, if you keep on reading in 1 Kings 12, that Rehoboam does not make the burdens lighter on the people. In fact, he's like, I'm going to make your burdens even heavier than my dad did. You're going to fear me. And the people are like, yeah, we're done with this. And then they split into 2 nations, and it becomes Judah, which is the southern nation where Rehoboam reigns, and then Israel becomes the northern nation where Jeroboam ends up becoming the first king. So even though Solomon was a very good king and built a lot of things up, made Israel very wealthy, he gave his people just too much to bear. And that caused a rift towards the end of his life and right after he died. But going back to our passage today, 2 Chronicles 8, verse 11, it says, Solomon brought up Pharaoh's daughter out of David's city to the house that he had built for her. For he said, My wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places where Yahweh's ark has come are holy. So that's basically Solomon admitting that his wife is a pagan. Okay, because Solomon was not opposed to foreigners coming to the temple of God. In fact, he said that in his prayer a few chapters back. He asked God to actually bless the foreigners that worship Yahweh's name. So why would Solomon be not comfy with his Egyptian wife being near the Ark of God? Because she worshiped Egyptian gods and foreign deities, and he knew that, and yet he still married her, even though he knew that she was pagan. And that specifically went against God's commands for the king and for other Israelites. They were not supposed to intermarry with other religions. They were only supposed to marry people within Israel, people who worshiped God. And that's the same thing actually nowadays. I'm sure you've heard the adage, do not be unequally yoked in your marriage. That basically means if you are a Christian, you should not marry somebody who is not a Christian, because that's just going to cause a divide in your marriage, like right off the bat, because you have really different viewpoints, different beliefs, kind of your core values are just too different, and that causes problems. So Christians are supposed to marry Christians. And the same thing went with the Jewish people back in these days. They were only supposed to marry other Jewish people, not due to racism or anything like that, but because Jewish people worshiped God. And that was the most important thing. Now, if Solomon's Egyptian wife had become a Yahweh follower, there would have been no problem with Solomon marrying her. But she did not turn to Yahweh. And Solomon, knowing that she is pagan and unholy because of this, he decides to get her out of Jerusalem, and he builds her a house on the edge of Jerusalem where he can go and visit her whenever he wants to, but she's not inside the city because she was pagan, because she worshiped other deities and foreign gods. We find out later on that Solomon actually built shrines for her gods, and Solomon married a billion other women and he built shrines for like all of his wives. It was a really bad thing. But the fact of the matter is, Solomon knew the commandment and yet disobeyed it. In fact, he disobeyed pretty much all the commandments for kings laid out in Deuteronomy 17. And I've talked about these rules a trillion times at this point, but I'm going to go back over them once again. Deuteronomy 17:14 through 17. When you come into the land which Yahweh your God gives you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like the nations are around me, you shall surely set him whom Yahweh your God chooses as king over yourselves. You shall set as king over you one of you from among your brothers. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he may multiply horses, because Yahweh has said to you, you shall not go back that way again. He shall not multiply wives to himself, that his heart not turn away. He shall not greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. So literally in 2 Chronicles 8, I'm pretty sure Solomon breaks every single one of these rules in this chapter. So first and foremost, he becomes unequally yoked. You know, Solomon himself, yes, he was a Jewish man, but he was being influenced by foreigners, by people who did not know Yahweh or the customs of Israel and Jerusalem. And yet Solomon had ties with these women and ended up kind of turning his heart towards what they wanted instead of what Yahweh wanted. So that's the first thing he did wrong. Secondly, he made the people return to Egypt, both for horses and also because his wife was from Egypt. God said, you should not go back that way again. So Israel was not supposed to have any ties with Egypt at all because Egypt was the land that had brutally enslaved the Jewish people. God had mercy on the Egyptians and did not destroy them because of that. But God said, don't go back to Egypt. Don't trust them because they made you slaves centuries before this and they will not be on your side. And that ended up turning out true every single time Israel did make an alliance with Egypt. Egypt would kind of like backstab them or just not follow through, like every single time. And then on top of that, Solomon multiplied wives to himself, but he had about 1,000 wives, 700 wives, 300 concubines. And he definitely multiplied silver and gold to himself, which is probably what some of those storage cities were for. So yes, Solomon broke every single rule for the kings, and that's kind of laid out in our chapter for today. But moving forward in 2 Chronicles 8, 12 and 13 talk about how Solomon did worship God. In fact, he did it quite religiously. He offered a sacrifice every single day and also on the 3 feasts every single year and the Sabbaths and the new moons. So Solomon was quite religious and did what God told him to do in that respect. But unfortunately, his heart was not fully with Yahweh. And he also did not follow the commands of Yahweh. Verses 14 and 15 talk about his organizational skills and how he made sure to do everything that David, his father, had put in place with the Levitical priests. Solomon did all of that. So the temple ran very efficiently. And that's a good thing, obviously, because if the temple is running efficiently and the priests are all unified and doing what the commandments say to do, then worship in Israel was going to be a lot more successful than if that wasn't the case. But to conclude this passage, it says in verse 16, "Now all the work of Solomon was accomplished from the day of the foundation of Yahweh's house until it was finished. So Yahweh's house was completed." So everything that could have been done in God's house was done. Because even though the temple was dedicated in the past 2 chapters, that doesn't mean that there weren't some kinks that needed to be ironed out throughout the years. Solomon ironed out all of those kinks. And once again, the temple was running very, very efficiently under Solomon. But verses 17 and 18 are quite interesting because Solomon did something that no Israelite king had done before and probably never even deemed possible. It says Solomon went to Ezion-Geber and to Eloth on the seashore in the land of Edom. Hiram sent him ships and servants who had knowledge of the sea by the hands of his servants, and they came with the servants of Solomon to Ophir and brought from there 450 talents of gold and brought them to King Solomon. Solomon taught his people to be sailors. He partnered with King Hiram, and together they formed this alliance where they would go search the seas for all of these amazing things. They went as far as Ophir, and we have no clue where Ophir is, but some people guess actually India or off the coast of the west side of Africa. Israel had never done anything like that ever before. Yes, they had their little boats in their lakes and rivers, but they had never become seafarers before. So this was something very new that Solomon had accomplished with the Israelite people. No other king had done this ever before in Israel's history, and it was an impressive thing. And these Israelites were going to Ophir and bringing back all sorts of silver and gold and precious jewels and ivory and all sorts of stuff that was very expensive back in the days of Solomon. So Solomon achieved things that no other king had ever done. And you can see how the wisdom that God gave Solomon is really flourishing with all of the various endeavors that Solomon had his people do. But as impressive as Solomon had become, and as impressive as Israel had become, there were little cracks forming that were going unnoticed, that were becoming very, very serious. Well, faithful listeners, I hope you enjoyed listening to 2 Chronicles chapter 8 and the various successes that Solomon had in Israel and just how impressive the nation had become. But we'll talk more about some of the flaws that Israel is starting to show even under the reign of Solomon. So we will get into all of that on Wednesday. I hope to see all of you then. But of course, tomorrow we're going to be talking more about 1 Timothy, and I'm excited to talk about this book. So I hope you guys tune in then, 6 a.m. or whenever you choose to wake up and listen for an episode tomorrow from 1 Timothy. Happy listening, and God bless.